I did not expect the first sound I heard when I stepped out of the taxi to be my own stepfather laughing. 10 weeks of basic training at Fort Jackson had taught me disciplined patience control under pressure, but nothing prepared me for the sight of Rick Hanlon standing on the porch of my mother's house with his arms folded across his chest, a half-finished beer on the railing, and that smirk he always used whenever he wanted me to feel small. The October rain in Fayetteville came down in thin, cold needles soaking through my uniform blouse before I even reached the bottom step. I adjusted my duffel on my shoulder, lifted my chin the way Drill Sergeant Price had drilled into me, and tried to breathe through the tightness in my chest. I was a soldier now. I had imagined this moment differently, a quiet hug from my mother, maybe a small proud smile. Instead, I heard the screen door creak open, and Colton, my 25-year-old half-brother, stuck his head out with a grin so wide it showed the cheap beer still on his breath. "Look at you, private puppy," he said, as if he had been rehearsing the line for weeks. Rick barked a laugh as though it was the funniest joke he had ever heard. My boots hit the muddy walkway. The whole yard was a mess, patches of grass torn up from the pit bull. Rick kept chained near the fence, a broken lawn chair half buried in mud, and the metal dog cage sitting lopsided beside the porch. The moment I saw the cage, something in my stomach tightened. I stepped onto the porch hoping for at least a nod from my mother, but she was nowhere in sight. Rick leaned toward me, squinting at my uniform, his mouth curling like he smelled something rotten. "So the Army actually took you," he said. "Guess they were desperate this year." I kept my breathing steady, just like Basic had taught me. "Do not react, do not break posture." I answered, "Yes, sir," in the calmest tone I could manage. He snorted. "Sir." He pointed a finger toward his chest. "You don't call me sir in this house. You call me the man who kept a roof over your head while you ran away to play soldier." Rain dripped from my cap brim. My fingers tightened on the duffel strap. Colton stepped behind me, nudging me with his elbow. "Seriously, Avery, you look hilarious in that uniform. Does it come in women's sizes, or did they just shrink a men's one for you?" Another jab of laughter, another sting under my ribs. I pushed past them and dragged my duffel inside. The house smelled like stale beer and fried food. My mother's voice floated from the kitchen, thin and shaky, as if she were ashamed to even greet me. I swallowed hard, but before I could call out to her, Rick grabbed the collar of my uniform and yanked me backward toward the door. "Not so fast," he said. "You walk in here acting like some hero now. You think wearing that makes you better than me?" My shoulder hit the doorframe. Pain shot down my arm. I bit my lip until I tasted metal. "I am just here to visit, sir. I am leaving for AIT soon." He laughed again, louder this time, the kind of laugh that made my skin crawl. "Visit." He turned to Colton. "Hear that? She thinks she can come back here and act like a guest." Rain blew in through the doorway, soaking the hardwood floor. Rick shoved me out onto the porch. My boot slipped on the wet boards, and I grabbed the railing to catch myself. Behind me, Colton whistled. "Careful, private puppy. Don't fall." I looked up at Rick, bracing myself. He stepped closer, the rain matting his thinning hair to his forehead. He tilted his head toward the pit bull's cage. "You know I have been thinking." He tapped his fingers on the metal bars. "Dogs know their place around here. They stay quiet, keep their heads down, listen to the man of the house." I tried to step back, but he blocked me with his arm. Then he said the sentence that would stain itself into my memory forever. "You are just my dog, you hear me?" My breath caught. "Sir, I don't want any trouble." Rick grabbed a muddy leash from a hook beside the door. The pit bull barked somewhere behind the fence, but it sounded drowned out by the rain hammering the tin roof. "Kneel," he said. My ears rang. The air turned cold. I shook my head, unable to make sense of what was happening. He shoved my shoulder, and I dropped to one knee in the mud, my hand slamming against the wet ground. Colton laughed in a way I had not heard since we were kids, cruel, childish, loud. "Dad, she actually looks like a dog now." Rick looped the leash around my upper arm, then around my neck, tugging it tight enough to make me gasp. The metal latch clicked against the bar of the cage. The pressure around my throat tightened as he pulled me closer to the kennel door. My palms sank into the mud. Rain ran down my face, mixing with the dirt. My lungs fought for air while my mind replayed every drill, every command to stay calm. Colton crouched beside me, grinning. Hey, Avery, since you're home, can you bark for us? Another laugh, another twist in my chest. Rick leaned down close enough that I could smell the alcohol on his breath. Army soldier, you are nothing in this house. Nothing. Something inside me hardened. I stopped shaking. My fingers dug into the mud, gripping it like a promise I had not yet spoken. The rain muffled everything except the quiet rise of my own breathing. I did not shout. I did not cry. I held the silence the way a soldier holds a rifle steady, waiting for the right moment. Where are you watching from, and what would you do if this happened to you? People always assume soldiers come from solid homes where someone taught them discipline, strength, or pride long before the Army ever did. But my story is the opposite. I did not join because I felt brave or patriotic at first. I joined because home never felt like home, and because every hallway, every chair, every family dinner reminded me that I was the extra piece in a puzzle that Rick and Colton never wanted completed. Before I left for basic training, I was just Avery Dalton, 22 years old, living in a small beige house off Ramsey Street, trying to survive one day at a time. I had finished community college with an associate degree in general studies because that was all I could afford. I worked mornings at a grocery store and evenings bussing tables at a diner because someone had to keep food in the fridge. Rick always said real adults worked with their hands, not with books. So he mocked my degree and tossed my graduation photo into a drawer without looking at it. My mother, Linda Dalton, used to be softer, brighter before Rick came into her life. She loved sunflowers, bright yellow curtains, and humming old country songs in the kitchen. Years of being told she was irresponsible with money, incompetent and ungrateful, dimmed everything in her. She still hugged me, but her hugs became shorter and her smiles more forced, as if afraid Rick might walk in and accuse her of loving me too much. She worked part-time as a cashier, but never saw her paycheck. Rick insisted on managing the household budget. That meant taking her card, holding her account login, and handing her $20 at a time like an allowance. Colton, the chosen one, the golden boy of the house, was 25 going on 12. He had tried 3 jobs and quit each after a few weeks, but Rick always found a reason to defend him. He has potential. He is figuring himself out. Give him time. Meanwhile, when he crashed his truck, it was my mother who took money from her tiny savings to help pay repairs, and Rick who blamed me for not contributing enough to the household. The truth is, I had never once felt like part of this family. I was the outsider, the reminder of the years before Rick arrived. So he made sure I stayed on the outside. When I was 10, he made me eat dinner on the porch because I had talked back. I remember sitting alone at a cold metal table, hearing the laughter inside the house while gnats buzzed around my plate. Another time, he locked me out overnight because I forgot to take the trash out before dark. I huddled on a lawn chair listening to dogs bark down the street, praying the neighbors would not see. Holidays were the worst. Rick would raise his glass at Thanksgiving and joke in front of everyone about the Dalton disappointment, nodding toward me while Colton snickered. I learned to smile through it, learned to stay quiet, learned to pretend none of it hurt. But it did. It hurt deeply and quietly like a bruise that never healed. By the time I turned 21, I felt stuck. I worked 2 jobs, barely slept, and every time I came home, Rick had a new complaint. The dishes were not done right. My uniform from work threw off the smell of grease. I parked too close to his truck. Anything could set him off. My mother tried to defend me once, but he shouted at her until she cried, and after that, she rarely spoke up again. My breaking point came one night in early January while I was eating a sandwich standing over the kitchen counter because Rick did not like me using his dining chairs. He walked in, grabbed the sandwich out of my hand, and threw it into the sink. "If you want to live under my roof," he said, "you follow my rules." I looked at the wet pile of bread and turkey sliding toward the drain, and something inside me snapped. Not angrily, not loudly, just a soft realization that this was not living. This was surviving. I went into my room and stared at my reflection in the small cracked mirror above my dresser. My eyes looked tired, older than 21. But something else flickered underneath exhaustion, a quiet determination, a whisper, telling me there had to be more than this. 2 days later, during my lunch break at the diner, a sergeant in uniform walked in and sat at the counter. He looked calm, organized, everything about him steady. When he left, he dropped a pamphlet on the counter about Army careers. I picked it up and kept it folded in my apron pocket for weeks, reading it every chance I got. My mother saw it once and her face tightened with worry. Rick saw it and mocked me for even considering it. "You could not handle real life if it hit you," he said. But his words had lost their weight. I had already made up my mind. One morning in March before sunrise, I walked 5 miles to the recruiter's office because I did not want to ask Rick for a ride. I filled out the paperwork, took the tests, passed the medical checks, and signed my enlistment contract. When I came home with the envelope in my hand, my mother cried quietly, her fingers touching the edges of the paper. She asked if this was really what I wanted. I told her it was the only thing that made sense. Rick laughed loud enough for the neighbors to hear. "The Army is for losers," he said, "for the people who have nowhere else to go." Colton chimed in from the couch without looking up from his phone, saying, "Sounds perfect for Avery then." I packed that night a few changes of clothes, a toothbrush, a cheap notebook, and one pair of shoes. Everything I owned fit into a single worn backpack. They did not come to the bus station the next morning. My mother texted a small heart. Rick sent nothing. Colton posted a meme about trash taking itself out. As the bus pulled away from Fayetteville, I looked out the window and felt something I had never felt before. Freedom mixed with fear, mixed with hope. My heart was bruised but steady. I promised myself that day I would never let anyone put a leash on me again, figuratively or literally. I kept that promise all through basic training, but standing in the mud behind that house in October with a real leash tied around my neck, the old memories rose like ghosts, reminding me exactly why I had left and exactly why I would not stay silent this time. Nothing in my life before the Army prepared me for the moment. The bus rolled through the gates of Fort Jackson. The humidity wrapped around us like a heavy blanket, the kind that steals your breath before you realize you are suffocating. Drill sergeants stood waiting in their brown, round hats, pacing like restless storm clouds. And when the bus doors opened, all I heard was an explosion of voices ordering us off faster, louder. Move, move, move. I had seen videos online showing recruits scrambling off buses, but nothing captures the feeling of stepping down into a world where every mistake is noticed, every hesitation magnified. My heart pounded so hard it felt like it shook my entire chest, but my feet kept moving. I knew turning back was not an option. The first hours blurred together, running across the parking lot, dumping our belongings into bins, getting assigned to companies, and learning very quickly that the Army cares nothing for excuses. That was when I first heard the voice I would never forget. "Drill Sergeant Price." Tall, sharp-eyed, his voice carried across the formation without effort. He did not shout to intimidate. He projected authority with precision, like every syllable was placed exactly where he intended. When he walked past me in that first chaotic lineup, he paused. I felt his shadow before I looked up. "You here to work or you here to cry?" "Private," he said. I swallowed hard. "Here to work. Drill sergeant." He stared at me for one long second, then nodded once. "We will see. Basic training stripped me down to the bone before it rebuilt me." The first week was shock to the system, waking up at 04:30, stumbling into formation before my brain caught up with my body, learning how to stand still, how to march, how to breathe when my lungs felt like collapsing. But something strange happened. For the first time in my life, being quiet did not make me weak. It made me focused. Being told what to do did not make me small. It gave my days structure. Physical training became the rhythm that steadied my mind. Running in the dark with footsteps pounding around me made me feel less alone. I was part of something larger than myself, something that did not care about my past, only about what I was willing to do in the present. Drill Sergeant Price noticed early that I did not complain. Other recruits groaned, cursed, questioned why they joined, but I kept my head down and pushed through repetitions like each one removed a piece of the old life I carried. One morning during combatives training when we were practicing basic self-defense and ground control techniques, he stood behind me, arms folded. "Dalton," he said, "you know how to fight, or is this all new?" I hesitated before answering. "A little new, drill sergeant, but I am learning." He nodded. "Good. You do not flinch when you hit the mat. Most people flinch. That means you are used to getting back up." His words settled deeper than he probably intended. Getting back up was something I had done my whole life without anyone ever noticing. During Red Phase, when everything felt impossible, he pulled me aside after a long march. "You have potential," he said. "You just do not know it yet. Keep pushing and it will show." No one had ever said something like that to me. Not a teacher, not a relative, not even my mother who loved me but never truly saw me. His belief in me cracked something open. I began running harder, lifting more, pushing through mental walls I never knew I had. By White Phase, I was no longer the quiet girl trying to disappear. I was the one helping other recruits tie their gear properly, checking on the ones who struggled to keep up. For the first time in my life, I felt strong. Not because anyone told me to be, but because I had earned it. Hand-to-hand training nearly broke me the first time. Getting thrown onto the mat knocked the wind out of me. But I remembered every insult Rick ever hurled and every time Colton pushed me aside. I channeled all of it into steady, controlled movements, learning how to use leverage instead of brute force. Drill Sergeant Price watched me spar during one session, and afterward he said, "If you ever need to defend yourself in real life, remember control beats chaos. Stay calm, and you win before the fight even starts." That sentence would return to me months later in ways neither of us could have predicted. By Blue Phase, something felt different inside me. I stood straighter. My voice projected louder. The girl who once ate dinner alone on a porch now stood in front of her platoon, calling cadence without hesitation. On the final week of basic training, we lined up in the auditorium to receive our certificates. The lights reflected off our badges and uniforms. I held my head high as my name was called. When I shook hands with the commander, I felt something unfamiliar. Pride mixed with relief, mixed with a quiet belief that maybe I was not the disappointment Rick always claimed. That night in the barracks after lights out, Drill Sergeant Price walked through for final checks. When he reached my bunk, he tapped my bed frame. "Dalton. He said you are getting a 10-day leave before AIT. Use it wisely. You earned it." I thanked him, but as he walked away, doubt crept into my stomach. 10 days home. 10 days in that house. 10 days around Rick and Colton. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the soft breathing of 50 women around me, and wondered if I should go home at all. Part of me longed for my mother's hug, the one she used to give me before life got heavy. Another part remembered every cruel word, every cold night, every humiliation. In the morning, the leave papers sat folded inside my locker. I held them in my hands, tracing my name with my thumb. I whispered to myself, maybe they changed. Maybe things are different now. Before leaving Fort Jackson, I took a graduation photo wearing my uniform and cap. My smile was small but real. I wanted to show my mother that I had grown into someone stronger, someone worth being proud of. I wanted her to see that despite everything, I had become a soldier. I tucked the photo into my duffel bag, carefully smoothing the edges, thinking it might be the first picture she would actually display. On the bus ride back to Fayetteville, I watched the trees pass by, feeling both anxious and hopeful. I promised myself I would give them one chance to see the new version of me. One chance was all they were going to get. The bus dropped me off 2 blocks from the house because the driver could not turn around on our narrow street, and as I walked the last stretch with my duffel slung over my shoulder, I kept rehearsing the moment in my mind. Maybe my mother would open the door with tears in her eyes. Maybe she would reach out and touch the new patches on my uniform the way mothers do when they see their children become something more than what they feared. Maybe even Rick would keep his distance just long enough for me to breathe. Hope is a strange thing. It can grow even in places where nothing else survives. I held on to that hope as I walked up the cracked driveway, hearing the familiar groan of the loose gutter above the porch and the steady drip of water from the corner. The October air was cool but not cold, the kind of weather where leaves stick to the ground in damp yellow patches. My boots felt heavier with each step, as if the closer I came to that front door, the more my past tried to pull me back. When I reached the porch, the wooden boards sagged under my weight, just the way they always had. I stood still for a moment, breathing in the smell of the neighborhood pine trees, car oil, the faint sound of a lawnmower running somewhere in the distance. This was supposed to feel like home, but my chest tightened instead of opening. I raised my hand to knock, but before I could touch the door, it swung open with the screech that had never been fixed. Colton stood there grinning like he had been waiting for me purely for entertainment. His hair was messy, his shirt stained with something that looked like dried sauce, and his eyes lit up with the same mocking shine he always had when he looked at me. "Well, well, well," he said, leaning against the frame. "Look who thinks she is somebody now." I kept my face calm. "Hey, Colton." He snorted and stepped aside just far enough for me to enter without brushing against him. I walked in slowly, taking in the living room. The carpet was littered with crushed cans, the coffee table cluttered with takeaway boxes and ashtrays. The smell of beer mixed with stale cigarette smoke hit me so fast my stomach tightened. Nothing had changed. Not a single thing. Rick sat in his usual recliner, staring at the muted television, a half-empty can on his knee. When he turned his head toward me, the look in his eyes was not curiosity or surprise or even irritation. It was possession, as if he were inspecting something he believed belonged entirely to him. "Well, look at you," he said after a long pause. "Uniform and all." He tilted his head slightly as if checking for flaws. "So this is what you left us for." I swallowed the instinctive sting of his words and set my duffel beside the couch. "I am here for a short visit before I head to AIT, I said, keeping my voice steady. He raised an eyebrow. "Visit? As if you have earned the right to treat this house like a hotel." I felt Colton watching me from behind, waiting for a reaction. I did not give him one. Instead, I looked around the room, noting every sign of neglect, the dusty shelves, the broken lamp, the plates stacked in the sink, visible from where I stood. This had once been my mother's clean, warm living space. Now it looked like a place people passed through, not a place anyone took care of. Speaking of my mother, I did not see her. My chest tightened. "Where is Mom?" I asked. From the hallway, I heard a soft rustle of fabric, then a hesitant step. My mother appeared with her hair pulled back and her shoulders hunched as if she were trying to make herself smaller. She wore a faded blouse, and the faintest attempt of a smile tugged at her lips, but she would not look directly at me. "Welcome home, sweetie," she said quietly. Her voice trembled almost imperceptibly. She wiped her hands on her shirt unnecessarily, a nervous habit she never used to have. I stepped toward her, but she shifted her gaze to the floor and clasped her hands together. I realized she was waiting to see whether Rick approved of this moment. It told me more than any words could. I forced a smile anyway. "It is good to see you, Mom." She nodded once, but still did not raise her eyes. Rick let out a huff as if bored by the exchange and grabbed another can from a box beside his recliner. "You better not think coming back in that outfit gives you special privileges," he said. "We all had to work while you were gone." I glanced at Colton standing there doing absolutely nothing, and he grinned as if daring me to point it out. Instead, I said, "I will help out where I can." "I am only here for 10 days. Rick smirked. 10 days too long if you ask me. I held my breath for a moment, letting the words settle. These were the same patterns, the same tones, the same emotional traps. Only this time, something inside me did not bend the way it used to. The soldier in me, the part I earned with sweat bruises and sleepless nights, stood taller than the scared girl I used to be. I walked toward the dining table and set my graduation photo on the edge, hoping maybe my mother would look at it later when she was alone. Colton eyed it and smirked. "Cute," he said. "Does your little army let you take pictures like you are at summer camp?" Rick laughed from his chair, a rough, humorless sound. I ignored both of them. I focused on the details around me, the sagging curtains, the dent in the wall from an old argument, the stains on the carpet. My mother's eyes flicked toward Rick and then toward Colton as if checking for their reactions before daring to have her own. My heart ached for her more than it hurt for myself. I stepped closer to her and lowered my voice. "I missed you." She nodded again, barely lifting her gaze. "I missed you too." But she said it the way someone says a fact, not the way someone says a feeling. Behind us, Colton muttered, "Something tells me this is about to get good." Rick mumbled something under his breath and turned the volume up on the muted television, just enough to drown the quiet. I stood in the middle of the living room feeling that small flicker of hope fading just a bit, replaced by an old familiar heaviness. In that moment, I knew the truth. Nothing had changed. Not one thing. And I could already feel the storm that was coming. The first full day back in that house felt like someone had pressed rewind on my life and forced me to step back into a version of myself I thought I had outgrown. I woke early out of habit, my body still wired to army routines, but instead of the clean, structured quiet of a barracks, I woke to the sound of cans rolling across the living room floor and the television blaring from some late-night rerun Rick had fallen asleep watching. I stepped out of the small guest room, the one that used to be mine, and found Colton sprawled on the couch scrolling his phone with a bowl of cereal balanced on his chest. He did not look up when I passed, not until I reached the kitchen, and then his voice came floating behind me in a high-pitched teasing tone. "Hey, Bella." I froze. Bella was the name of the pit bull chained outside one of the names Rick shouted whenever he wanted someone or something to come running. Colton snickered loudly enough for Rick to hear. "The army dog is awake." I tightened my jaw, but said nothing. In basic training, silence was a tool one you learned to use to keep your power. I reached for a glass, but Rick stepped into the kitchen first, still wearing last night's shirt, the collar stretched and stained. He pushed the cabinet shut with his elbow and said, "If you are up, you might as well make yourself useful. I need the yard cleaned, leaves picked up, trash taken out, dishes washed, floors mopped." I looked at him for a moment, not out of defiance, but because I wanted to understand if he was being serious. He was. When I did not move quickly enough, he slapped his hand on the counter, making the silverware rattle. "Move," I said. "Work. That uniform does not make you queen of anything here." The morning passed in a haze of chores while Rick and Colton sat in the living room arguing about sports and laughing whenever they thought of something they could shout at me. "Bella, fetch this. Bella, carry that. Good girl, Avery, good girl." Each phrase landed like a small stone, hitting the same spot on my back over and over, not enough to break me, but enough to bruise. My mother drifted in and out of rooms, wiping the same countertop 3 times, pretending to tidy things that were already tidy. Every now and then, she paused as if she wanted to step in, but whenever she glanced toward Rick, she stopped. Once, when I bent to pick up a broken beer bottle in the yard, she whispered, "Avery, sweetie, let me do some of that," but Rick stepped onto the porch, and she froze mid-sentence. He raised an eyebrow, and she lowered her gaze, stepping back inside, as if someone had pulled invisible strings. I wanted to tell her it was okay, that I was stronger, now that she did not have to be afraid, but the words stuck in my throat. After 2 hours in the yard, my fingers were muddy and stiff from the damp air. I grabbed a trash bag and headed back inside. Rick was at the table tapping his fingers in a slow, impatient rhythm. He stared at me like someone inspecting a piece of furniture that failed to impress him. "Took you long enough," he said. "Thought soldiers were fast." I kept my voice even. "The yard is finished," he scoffed. "Then get in here and clean these dishes." He shoved a plate toward me, leaving a smear of sauce on the table that he clearly expected me to wipe. Colton added a cheerful, "Come on, Bella, be a good helper." I closed my eyes for half a breath and reminded myself of Drill Sergeant Price's voice in training. "Control beats chaos. Stay calm and you win before the fight even starts." I washed the dishes without saying a word, but Rick hated silence. He thrived on reaction, on control, on cracks forming in someone else's composure. "You think the army makes you better than me?" he suddenly shouted, slamming his hand on the table. The sound echoed through the kitchen. My mother jumped. Colton sat up straighter, waiting for the show to continue. "You strut in here with that uniform thinking you are somebody. Thinking you are tougher than me. You are nothing. Always have been nothing." His face reddened the way it always did when he had been drinking. My heart thudded, but my breathing stayed steady. The army did not make me think I was better. It made me understand I did not have to be afraid anymore. He stood and took a step toward me, invading my space, the smell of beer heavy on his breath. I held my ground. My mother reached out slightly, a reflex her body could not suppress, but she stopped when his eyes flashed toward her. He jabbed a finger at my chest. You hear me. You do not get to come into my house acting like you earned something. The uniform on my back felt heavier than usual, not because of the fabric, but because of the moment. He wanted to break me. He expected me to shrink the way I used to. I did not. I kept washing the dish in my hand, letting the warm water keep my mind steady. That seemed to anger him more. You think ignoring me makes you stronger, he said. You think you are too good to answer. Rick leaned closer, waiting for a crack, waiting for a tremble. I gave him none. Finally, he pushed back from the table, grabbed a jacket, and stormed out muttering something about getting another drink. The door slammed hard enough that the window rattled. I exhaled slowly, feeling the tension coil inside my stomach. Colton watched me from the couch, his eyes bright with the satisfaction of someone who felt safe behind another person's cruelty. He tossed a small rubber dog toy at my feet. In case you get bored, Private Bella. I did not look at him. I picked up the trash bag and walked to the porch to take it out. The air outside felt cold against my face, but it was a cleaner cold than the atmosphere inside. I looked at the pit bull cage, the metal bars glistening with dew. Something inside me stirred a quiet warning, a sense that something was shifting. The house was not just toxic. It was volatile. I could feel the pressure building like the slow rise of a storm at sea. And I knew deep down that the moment Rick felt his authority slipping, he would strike much harder than words or chores or insults. Standing there with the trash bag in my hand and the wind brushing against my uniform, I sensed the story was already turning toward something darker, something that would force me to use every ounce of strength the Army had taught me. The buildup was complete. The fall was coming. The rain started in soft tapping sounds against the windows just after sunset, the kind of steady Carolina drizzle that seeps into the air long before anyone notices, but by the time the evening dragged into night, the sky had opened up completely. Sheets of water blew sideways across the backyard, turning the dirt into thick mud and lighting up the metal dog cage each time the porch light flickered. I had hoped Rick would pass out early the way he sometimes did, but that night he returned from a gathering with his friends more wound up than usual, his footsteps heavy, his voice even heavier. The moment he pushed through the door, I smelled the alcohol before I saw the way he gripped the frame for balance. My mother froze mid-motion, dropping the dish towel she had been folding. Colton looked up from the couch with anticipation, like a child waiting for a firework to explode. Rick scanned the room, his eyes locking on me as if he had been searching for a reason to unleash whatever storm was brewing inside him. You, he said, pointing. Outside. Now. My stomach tightened, but I stayed calm. What do you need? I asked, keeping my tone steady. He stepped closer, the rain blowing in behind him. When I told you to visit, I did not mean take over my house, he said. I did not mean waltz around like you own the place. I cleared the dishes, I answered. Yard is done. Laundry is folded. Everything you asked. His jaw clenched. You think that makes you special. You think that uniform makes you untouchable. Behind him, Colton muttered under his breath. Here we go! Rick grabbed my arm so hard my shoulder jolted. Come outside, he growled. I pulled my arm free, but not aggressively, just enough to regain balance. Drill Sergeant Price's voice echoed through my mind. Control beats chaos. I am not going outside until you tell me why I said. Wrong answer. He shoved me backward and I stumbled against the hallway wall, catching myself with one hand. My mother gasped, but Rick shot her a look that turned her silent instantly. Outside! Now! His voice cracked with anger and alcohol. I stepped out onto the porch, letting the rain hit my face as if the cold might keep me steady. The backyard was nearly dark except for the flickering porch light reflecting off puddles. The dog cage sat near the fence, its metal slick with rain. I felt its presence before I saw it clearly, a shadow from my childhood rising again. Rick followed me out the door and the rain plastered his shirt to his chest. He moved toward me with the stumbling force of someone who thought size alone granted him power. He grabbed the front of my uniform and yanked, pushing me off the porch. My boots slid across the wet boards, and I hit the ground hard, the shock of it traveling up my spine. Cold mud splashed against my knees and palms. "You do not get to ignore me," he shouted. "You do not get to act like some hero in my house." I tried to stand. I really did. But he shoved me again, and I landed closer to the dog cage, the metal bars gleaming dully in the storm. My breathing grew shallow, not from fear, but from recognition. This moment had been coming since the second I stepped through that door. Rick kicked the mud near my knee, sending a spray of wet dirt across my sleeve. "Kneel!" he shouted over the wind. "That is where you belong!" I stared at him, rain dripping from my eyelashes, my heartbeat steady despite the cold spike of humiliation. Colton burst through the porch doorway, his laughter carrying over the storm. "Dad, this is insane," he said, but he said it the way someone encourages chaos, not the way someone stops it. Rick reached for the chain hanging from a hook beside the cage, and my stomach twisted. He wrapped the thick leash around his fist, then snapped it once the metal clasp clinking like a warning. I raised a hand, not in defense, but in instinct. "Rick, do not." He grabbed my shoulder, twisting me down until one knee hit the mud. "Do not tell me what to do in my own yard," he roared. My breath hitched, but I kept my posture controlled. Drill Sergeant Price's lessons hammered through my mind. Stay calm, stay centered, do not escalate. I could have taken Rick down easily. Basic had taught me how to break holds, how to control leverage, how to restrain someone twice my size. But using those skills on family without immediate danger could have ruined my career before it began. So I stayed still. Not out of fear, out of discipline. Rick forced my head down with his palm, pushing until my fingers spread into the mud to keep from falling forward. "A soldier who listens," he said with a cruel grin. "That is all you are." I felt the cold chain brush my arm, then tighten around my upper bicep as he looped it twice, pulling it firm. The clasp clicked into the metal bar of the cage with a sharp finality that pierced through the storm. My breath came out tight and hot against the freezing air. He yanked the leash, forcing my torso closer to the cage, the mud soaking into my knees and the rain burning my eyes. "You think you are better than me?" he shouted over the storm. "You are nothing! Nothing!" Colton's laughter echoed behind him, bubbling with sick delight. "This is insane," he repeated through breathless cackling. "She actually looks like she belongs out here." I kept my hands pressed into the mud, pushing up just enough to relieve the pressure on my chest. The chain bit into my skin cold and heavy. Rainwater streamed down my face, soaking into my collar. I swallowed hard, my throat tight, but my mind clear. Every moment of basic training lined up inside me like stepping stones. Keep your breathing measured. Keep your thoughts sharp. Never let humiliation dictate your actions. I heard Rick breathing hard above me, the storm, reflecting in the fury of his voice. My mother stood frozen in the doorway, her hand pressed over her mouth, her eyes wide with horror, but unable to move. "Avery, get up," she whispered, but the storm swallowed her voice before it reached me. I lifted my gaze toward Rick, and for the first time he stepped back slightly, as if startled by the steadiness in my eyes. He expected tears, begging, panic, but I was a soldier now, and a soldier learns to endure before they strike. The chain tightened again, pulling me closer to the metal bars. The mud under my palms grew colder, the storm louder, and something deep inside me shifted, a silent promise forming like steel heating in a forge. This moment was not breaking me. It was defining me. And Rick did not know it yet, but he had just pulled the last wrong leash of his life. The rain kept falling long after Rick and Colton stumbled back inside, laughing and arguing about who should get the last beer. Their voices faded muffled by the storm and the walls, but the echo of Rick's final shove lingered across my skin like a bruise that had not formed yet. I knelt in the mud beside the cage, the chain running from my upper arm to the cold metal bars. The latch rattled every time the wind gusted, a sharp metallic reminder of exactly where Rick believed I belonged. For a few seconds, or maybe minutes, I did not move. I let the rain wash over me until my hair clung to my face, and the mud beneath my knees softened into the shape of my weight. Every breath came out warm against the cold air. steady and controlled, the same way we learned to breathe when holding a firing position in training. My palms stayed pressed into the ground, fingers curling into the earth as the storm tore across the backyard. I was soaked, shivering, but not shaking. Something had settled inside me, something final. I lifted my head slowly. The porch light flickered again, spreading a trembling glow across the mud, making the raindrops look like sparks in the dark. The chain tugged slightly when I shifted my shoulder, metal scraping against metal with a low scrape that vibrated down the length of my arm. I tested the slack not to escape, but to understand its limits. Rick had looped it twice and clipped it tight. I could move maybe 2 feet in any direction enough to kneel, but not enough to stand. A deliberate choice. A humiliating choice. My jaw tightened. Not from fear, not from pain, but from clarity. Rick had crossed lines before countless times, but tonight he crossed the last one without even realizing it. He had dragged the last thread of the past into the present, and he had no idea who he had chained to that cage. I let my gaze drift toward the back door. It stood open just a crack, letting out a sliver of warm yellow light from the kitchen. Through it I could see shadows moving. Colton was pacing, probably retelling the story to himself as if he had done something impressive. My mother stood frozen near the counter, hands twisted together, her shoulders trembling even from where I sat. She looked like a ghost who had forgotten how to live inside her own home. I swallowed hard. A soldier protects the vulnerable. That thought came quietly but firmly, like Drill Sergeant Price's voice echoing through the storm. I had learned many things in basic training: how to fire a weapon, how to navigate terrain, how to fight at close range. But the most important lesson, the one Price drilled into us on day 1, rose above everything else. You do not break. You bend. You assess. You act with intent. And above all, you rise with purpose. My breaths slowed even more. The rain kept falling. My pulse matched its rhythm. I lifted my hands from the mud and wiped them slowly against my legs, clearing away some of the cold grit. Then I raised one hand to my throat and touched the tender skin where the chain had rubbed. I felt the slight swelling, the sting, the reminder of exactly what Rick had done. Not just tonight, but for years. My eyes sharpened, the softness gone. I was not the frightened girl he raised to obey. I was a trained soldier who knew how to endure discomfort and how to make decisions under pressure. And right now, I made one. Rick would not touch me like this again. Not him, not Colton, not anyone. I lowered my hand and pressed my palm into the mud once more. The cold seeped into my skin, grounding me. I leaned my head back against the cage bars, letting the metal rest against my skull. The rain ran down my face in controlled lines, and for the first time that night I inhaled a long, steady breath that filled my lungs and cleared my thoughts. I was not going to fight him with fists. That would make me like him, and that would risk everything I had worked for. But a soldier's strength is not in violence. It is in strategy, in timing, in precision. I closed my eyes briefly and pictured Rick at his birthday next week. Loud friends, family members he always tried to impress. A yard full of people who had heard only his side of life for years. A projector sitting in the garage because he always bragged about his backyard movie nights. The paperwork I already suspected he hid. The security camera in the corner of the yard that he never remembered to unplug. The leverage, the exposure, the justice. When I opened my eyes again, they felt different, clearer, harder. The girl Rick tried to humiliate no longer existed. The soldier he chained without knowing was the one kneeling in the mud now. And that soldier had a plan. I shifted my legs and moved closer to the cage wall. The chain allowed it. I reached up with one hand and pressed my fingers against the lock. It was old, rusted, and clumsy. I could pick it with a hairpin if I had one. But I did not need to. Rick would let me out when he wanted something. And when he did, he would have no idea what he had just set in motion. The storm thundered above me. I straightened my spine, even though the chain forced my shoulders slightly forward. Kneeling was not submission. Not tonight. Tonight, it was preparation. If the Army taught me anything, it was that you rise not when you are allowed to, but when you decide to. And I had decided, quietly, completely, with absolute resolve. I was going to bring Rick to justice, not with rage, not with fists, but with exposure, truth, and consequences that no one could ignore. I kept my eyes on the house, the soft light flickering the silhouettes moving behind the glass. My voice stayed inside me steady and silent. If the Army taught me anything, it was how to stand up the right way. And tomorrow, Rick Hanlon would meet the soldier he thought he had broken. I waited until the house finally fell silent. The rain softened into a mist, the kind that made the backyard glow faintly under the dying porch light. Rick had stumbled to bed hours ago, and Colton had passed out on the couch, halfway through a football rerun, beer still in his hand. My mother had retreated to her room like a shadow retreating from light, closing the door quietly, as if afraid it might wake a sleeping monster. The chain around my arm ached, but when Rick came back out earlier to grab another beer and muttered that he would deal with me in the morning, he loosened it just enough so I could sit back against the cage wall. He probably did it so I would stop whining, as he said, but all he did was give me the slack I needed. At 3 in the morning, when the last light clicked off inside the house, I timed my movements with every rumble of distant thunder. I shifted, pulled, and twisted my arm until the loop around my bicep slipped just enough for me to slide free. Not painless, not easy, but possible. He had not clipped it through a padlock, just wrapped it and latched it sloppy from alcohol and arrogance. Typical Rick. He never imagined I could get out. I moved silently through the wet grass, every muscle trained to avoid noise. My boots were still inside the house, so my feet were bare cold and sinking into the soft mud with each step. I crept up the back steps, eased the door open just enough to squeeze through, and stepped into the kitchen. The smell of stale beer and cigarettes hung heavy in the air. The light over the sink hummed faintly, casting a dull glow that stretched across the floor. My reflection in the microwave door stopped me for a second. Wet hair mud streaked down my jawline uniform. Dirty chain marks visible on my arm. I should have looked broken. I didn't. I looked determined. A soldier studying a mission map came to mind, and that made me straighten my shoulders a little. My mission tonight was simple: gather intel. Understand the enemy. Build the truth brick by brick. Because when you want to take down a man like Rick Hanlon, you do not start with fists. You start with facts. His bedroom door creaked the way it always had, but Rick snored loud enough to cover any sound. I slipped inside slowly. The room was a mess. Clothes thrown over chairs, empty beer bottles on the nightstand, a cracked lamp leaning at an angle like it had given up years ago. But the thing that drew my attention was the metal lockbox under his bed. Rick thought keeping it under the mattress made it invisible because no one else was smart enough to look there. My hands moved quickly. I pulled it out using my fingertips, careful not to disturb anything else. The box was heavy. I carried it into the hallway where the light from the window helped me see the lock. A cheap keypad. I tried the year he married my mother. No luck. I tried his birthday. No luck. I closed my eyes and pictured him signing documents, smirking, bragging about being the man of the house. And then it came to me. His ego. He would use the one number he cared most about. I typed 0001. The box clicked open instantly. My heart tightened, not from fear, but from absolute confirmation of who he was. And inside, everything I suspected waited like a stack of confession letters. Bank statements showing withdrawals from my mother's account thousands at a time. Receipts from a local casino proving gambling debts. Loan documents with my mother's forged signature on the second mortgage. A hidden loan for $25,000 taken out in her name without her knowledge. Insurance papers naming Rick as full beneficiary in the event of my mother's death, updated only 8 months ago. And then, shoved into the back corner buried under a pile of unpaid bills, was something that made the breath catch in my throat. A small USB drive with a piece of masking tape on it labeled Backup Cam 2018. My hand shook slightly when I picked it up. Backup Cam 2018. I was 16 in 2010. That was the year Rick had tied me to the back porch railing during a snowstorm because I broke a plate while washing dishes. A memory I buried so deep I sometimes convinced myself I exaggerated it. But the camera he installed for safety might have captured everything. And he kept it. He kept it. I felt my pulse hammering in my ears. The house seemed too quiet, like the walls were listening, waiting. I pocketed the USB, then gathered all the financial documents, folded them into a neat stack, and held them to my chest. This was no longer just about what he did to me tonight. This was about years of abuse, manipulation, financial control, and cruelty. This was bigger than a single night in the rain. This was a legacy of harm, and I was holding the evidence of it in my hands. I took one last look through the room, making sure nothing was disturbed. Then I moved to the garage. Rick never thought anyone would check his old tools, but the security system monitor sat on a shelf near the back, blinking slowly. I clicked through the menus with careful fingers until I found archived footage. The files were labeled by date. The night he tied me at 16 was right there. The camera angle showed the yard, the railing, the snow falling in thick sheets, and my younger self curled up, trembling, tied to the post with a rope he used for the dog. I wanted to cry, but soldiers compartmentalize. We process later. We act now. I downloaded the footage onto the USB, fingers steady, even though my body shook inside. When it was done, I pressed the power button until the screen went black. I needed Rick blinded. He should never know what evidence I had until the moment it mattered most. As I walked back through the dark hallway toward my old room, the documents tucked under my arm felt heavier than any gear I had carried at Fort Jackson. But the weight did not crush me. It empowered me. This was my ammunition. This was my armor. And this was the truth that would finally dismantle Rick Hanlon from the inside out. I shut my bedroom door quietly and leaned against it, clutching everything to my chest. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. Not a physical one, a strategic one, a soldier's fight. And for the first time in my life, I felt certain I could win. I sat on the floor of my childhood bedroom for nearly an hour. The stack of documents spread out around me like fragments of a broken truth. The rain had quieted into a faint whisper against the window, and each breath I took felt heavier than the one before it. Every piece of paper, every signature, every timestamp on that USB was a thread in a story I had tried to outrun. But the hardest part, I knew, was not confronting Rick. It was confronting the quiet shadow just down the hallway. My mother, Linda Dalton, the woman who raised me and hid behind silence for far too long. At a little past 5 in the morning, I heard her door open. Her footsteps were light, almost weightless, as if she tried not to disturb the house that never cared about disturbing her. She shuffled into the kitchen, probably to start coffee for Rick before he woke, because that had always been her ritual: survival by routine, submission by habit. I took a deep breath, gathered the stack of documents into a neat pile, slipped the USB into my pocket, and stepped into the hallway. The soft floor creaked beneath my feet. My mother stood at the counter, back-turned hands trembling as she held the coffee scoop. She looked smaller than I remembered, shoulders curved inward, hair slightly gray at the roots. The robe she wore hung too loosely around her frame. When I said her name softly, she flinched so hard the scoop flew from her hand and scattered coffee grounds across the counter. She spun eyes wide, breathing quick and shallow until she realized it was me. And even then, she didn't relax, only softened by a fraction. "Avery, you scared me," she whispered, as if I were a stranger arriving unannounced instead of her own daughter standing in her own childhood home. I swallowed down the ache rising in my throat. "Mom, we need to talk." Her eyes darted toward Rick's closed bedroom door. Her voice dropped immediately. "Not now, honey. He is still asleep." I moved to stand between her and the hallway door, lowering my voice but keeping it firm. "Yes, now." For a moment, she held still. Her hands pressed against the counter behind her, bracing her weight. She looked at me the same way she looked at storms approaching through the kitchen window when I was a child, fearful, predicting disaster. But she did not move. Not away, not toward me, just frozen. I placed the documents on the table, one by one: bank statements, forged signatures, gambling debts, insurance forms, and finally the printed screenshot from the security footage files showing 16-year-old me tied to the railing in the snow. She stared at the papers like they were landmines. Her breath staggered in her throat before finally breaking into a quiet, trembling sound that made the hairs rise on my arms. "Avery, where did you get these?" she whispered. I met her eyes. From his room. Her lips parted. Her throat tightened visibly. For a moment, she pressed a hand to her mouth as if trying to hold in a cry. Then she whispered something so small it almost disappeared in the air. I knew he kept things from me, but I never knew he kept that. Her gaze dropped to the photo again. Her hand shook so violently she had to lower it to her lap to steady herself. Everything inside me wanted to wrap my arms around her right then, but I needed her to speak, to finally say the truth out loud. "Mom," I said gently, "tell me what he did to you." She stiffened instantly, shoulders rising, chin tightening, years of silence forming a wall so thick I could almost see it. I moved closer, lowered my voice. "Mom, please. I am your daughter, and I am not a child anymore. I am a soldier. You do not have to protect me from the truth." Her lips quivered once, twice, then broke. "He has been hurting me for years, Avery." Her voice cracked the moment she said it. He started with yelling, then throwing things, then calling me names for hours. Then it became pushing, shaking, grabbing. One night, he pushed me into the wall so hard I saw black spots for minutes. I opened my mouth, but nothing came out. She kept going as if a dam had finally burst. I tried to leave once. I packed a bag. I got as far as the front porch. He grabbed me by the arm so hard I couldn't move it for a week. He told me if I ever walked out again, he would go after you. He said you were weak and frightened, and no one would believe you if something happened. My chest tightened with a fierce burn, a heat so sharp it made my vision blur. All those years I thought she didn't fight for me. All those years I thought she chose him, and she was enduring all of it to keep me safe. "Mom," I whispered through the word barely held together. "Why didn't you tell me?" Her hands flew up, suddenly covering her face as she sobbed into her palms. "I didn't want you to hate me. I didn't want you to think I failed you, and I didn't want to drag you back into this house when I knew you were trying so hard to build a life away from it." I stepped forward slowly and put my arms around her. She collapsed into me as if her bones had lost their strength. I held her tight, strong, anchored, the way I wished someone had held me when I was 16, tied to a railing in the snow. "You never failed me," I whispered into her hair. "You protected me the only way you could, but it is my turn now." She pulled back just enough to look into my face. Her eyes were swollen with tears, but behind them something flickered, something like hope. "What are you going to do, Avery?" The truth rose inside me with the steadiness of a vow. "I am going to end this, not with violence, with truth, with evidence, with consequences he cannot escape. And you will never be alone again." She pressed her forehead to mine the way she used to when I had nightmares as a child. Her voice trembled but held a thin thread of courage. "I believe you. I believe in you." I closed my eyes and held her tighter. That moment was more powerful than any graduation, any training, any rank I could earn. A mother finally speaking, a daughter finally hearing the truth, and a soldier finally stepping into her mission with purpose. For the first time in my life, I felt something shift inside this house. Not physically, not in the walls or the air, but in me. The silence had broken. The truth had been spoken. And now the justice was coming. The house felt different after my mother finally told the truth. Not safer, not warmer, just stripped of its illusion. Every corner of it looked exactly as it had my whole life, but nothing felt the same. The silence wasn't oppressive anymore. It wasn't a cage, it was a countdown. I stayed awake as the first light of morning crept through the blinds, the documents spread across the dining table like pieces of a battlefield map. My mother sat beside me wrapped in her robe, hands around a cup of untouched coffee. She kept glancing toward Rick's room nervously, but I could see a new stiffness in her shoulders. She was afraid, but she was also exhausted from decades of fear, and exhaustion is a powerful fuel for courage. "Mom," I said quietly, "tell me exactly when his birthday party is." She blinked at me, surprised by the question, then whispered, "Saturday. The big one. 50. He has been planning it for months. there will be over 50 people, maybe more. Maybe the entire Hanlon side of the family, his coworkers, a few neighbors. He even rented a projector because he said he wanted a slideshow about his life. My breath caught in my throat. A projector? Perfect. That is where it will happen, I said. She looked at me as if she didn't fully understand. Where what will happen, Avery? The truth, I answered, and the truth needs an audience. She pressed a trembling hand over her mouth. Does it have to be public? Everything in me stilled, then hardened into something unshakable. Yes, because men like Rick do not fall in private. They fall when the world sees exactly who they really are. I expected her to object, but she didn't. She inhaled slowly, then nodded once, as if surrendering to a tide she knew she could not hold back. I reached across the table and covered her hand with mine. I promise you it will be controlled. No fighting, no chaos, no danger, just truth. The kind that does not need fists. She looked at me with a mixture of fear and relief. Then I do not want to stop you, she whispered. Something inside me steadied at those words. Permission wasn't what I needed, but hearing them made my resolve settle deeper. After she went to rest, I began working. Soldier mode, mission planning, not emotional, not reactive, deliberate. First, I sorted through every document we had. I arranged the bank statements by date, the forged signatures, the gambling debts, the loan documents, the insurance papers. I printed screenshots of the video footage from the night Rick tied me at 16 and selected the frame that showed the rope clearly. My hands stayed steady the entire time. At Fort Jackson, they teach us to operate under stress, to prioritize, to break tasks into pieces until nothing feels impossible. I used those skills now. Next, I pulled out my old laptop and created a slideshow. Not dramatic, not sensational, just factual. Dates, numbers, screenshots, short captions. A calm, irrefutable story, proof of years of abuse. Financial manipulation, physical danger, proof of a man who deserved to be seen for exactly what he was. Then I added the final slide, a short sentence. Do you still believe this man deserves your loyalty? I stared at that line for a long moment. It felt right. At around noon, I heard Rick waking up coughing harshly as he stumbled into the kitchen. I snapped the laptop shut and shoved the papers under my bed. He walked by my room reeking of beer and muttered something about me cleaning the garage later. I didn't answer. I didn't need to. He had no idea that every step he took brought him closer to the edge of a cliff he built himself. I spent that afternoon pretending to organize the garage while he barked orders. My mother stayed small and quiet the entire time, but when our eyes met for the first time in years, I saw a glimmer of something alive in her, and I wondered if she realized she was watching the end of something that had ruled her life for decades. That night, after Rick and Colton left to go drinking, I tested the projector he rented. A shiny black machine still in the box, sitting in the living room like an omen. I powered it on. A bright rectangle of light filled the wall. Perfect clarity. Big enough for 50 people to see every detail. My chest tightened with anticipation. I inserted the USB drive. The first slide appeared, Rick's forged signature. The next, withdrawal slips. The next, casino debt. The next, the screenshot of 16-year-old me tied to the railing in the snow. My breath shuddered, but I didn't look away. This was the past. But Saturday would be the reckoning. I unplugged everything and repacked the projector carefully. No fingerprints, no changed settings. Rick couldn't know a thing. The next 2 days were filled with small acts of planning. I created a folder with backup copies of every document. I hid an envelope under the passenger seat of my car with printed evidence in case anything happened. I texted myself timestamps from the video archives. I memorized the order of the slides and the sequence of proof. And more than once, I stood in the backyard at night, looking at the dog cage where Rick had chained me. I stared at it until my breathing slowed to the rhythm of something cold and focused. I spoke to my mother minimally during those days. She needed rest. She needed distance from the storm that was coming. But on the night before the party, she found me on the porch. She stepped outside slowly, her robe pulled tight around her. "Avery," she whispered. Are you sure you want to do this? I turned toward her. The porch light cast a halo around her face. For the first time, she didn't look broken. She looked human again. I am sure I said, because this is not just about me. This is about every year he stole from you, every bruise he left, every threat he used to trap you here. And tomorrow you will never have to fear him again. Her chin quivered, but she nodded. Then she stepped forward and held my hand, the way she used to when I was a child crossing the street. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Then she whispered, I will sit in the front row. Emotion clawed up my chest, but I pushed it down with controlled breath. Thank you, Mom. She squeezed my hand once more before going back inside. I remained on the porch long after she disappeared into the hallway. The yard was silent, the air cool, the cage still sitting in the shadows. In basic training, they say there is always a quiet moment before a mission, a breath where the world stills right before everything changes. This was that breath. Rick Hanlon's 50th birthday party would be his stage, but the truth would be mine. And when the truth finally spoke, it would be loud enough for everyone to hear. The afternoon of Rick Hanlon's 50th birthday felt strangely calm, almost like the quiet before a range exercise begins. The yard buzzed with voices, laughter, and the clinking of beer bottles. Cars lined the driveway and spilled down the street. Folding tables covered in cheap plastic cloths were arranged in rows. Balloons with the number 50 bobbed above the crowd. The smell of barbecue filled the air. Everything looked normal, cheerful, harmless. But beneath that cheer was the truth only I carried. And today, I was going to give it a voice. I stood at my bedroom window for a long moment watching people arrive. Aunts from Rick's side who always pretended not to notice bruises. Uncles who joked that I was too sensitive. Cousins who worshipped Rick like he was some hometown hero. Neighbors he bragged to about having a soldier in the family even though he never supported me a single day in my life. And then Colton stepped outside wearing a button-down shirt, 2 sizes too tight sunglasses, even though it was cloudy, and that smug grin he always put on when he wanted to look important. He strutted like he owned the house, calling out greetings, slapping people on the back, soaking in every ounce of attention. Inside the living room, I could hear Rick's booming laugh. Loud, cocky. He was already bragging about how much meat he bought for the grill and how he held this family together. Typical. I opened my closet slowly and took out my ACU uniform. The fabric felt heavier today, not because of the weight, but because of what it represented. Strength, discipline, transformation, and contrast. I put it on piece by piece, fastening each button with steady hands, tying the laces on my boots with deliberate tension, adjusting the sleeves the way Drill Sergeant Price taught me. When I looked at myself in the mirror, I saw 2 versions of me overlaid. The girl Rick tried to crush, and the soldier he never expected to face. I walked out of the room and down the hallway. My mother stood near the kitchen doorway wearing a simple blue blouse. Her hands were clasped tightly in front of her, but when she saw me in uniform, she straightened her posture as if something inside her gained strength through me. You look strong, she whispered. I nodded once. Today I need to be. I stepped out onto the porch. Conversations died mid-sentence. The laughter faded. Heads turned one by one. I walked forward, boots hitting the deck with controlled, even steps. Some people smiled awkwardly, some nodded politely, but most stared. Rick turned last. When he saw me, his expression froze for a split second before twisting into a smirk. Well, look who decided to show up, he said loud enough for everyone to hear. The prodigal soldier. And you wore the costume too. Laughter rippled through a few guests. My mother flinched. I didn't. I stood straight, hands relaxed at my sides, eyes fixed on him. This is my uniform, I said clearly. It is not a costume. His smirk faltered for a breath, but he quickly recovered. You think that makes you special. You think that makes you better than this family. Before I could answer, one of his brothers clapped him on the shoulder. Come on, Rick, lighten up. It is your big day. Rick laughed again and puffed out his chest. My big day. My party. My house. My rules. Then he gestured dramatically toward the projector table behind him. And later on, when we start the slideshow, you all are going to see what real accomplishment looks like. The irony almost made me smile. Instead, I walked toward the table, weaving through clusters of people. Guests parted instinctively, almost like they sensed the air shifting. Rick watched me with growing irritation. "What do you think you are doing touching my stuff?" His voice sharpened, but I ignored him. I plugged in the projector, inserted the USB, powered the machine on. A bright white square filled the sheet he had hung as a screen. Conversations died completely now. Rick stomped toward me. "I swear. Avery, if you mess with my party, I will." "You will what?" I said quietly but firmly. "Hurt me in front of everyone." The crowd stirred. A few people glanced nervously between us. One of the neighbors whispered something to her husband and took half a step back. Rick's jaw clenched. "Turn it off!" he barked. "Right now!" I didn't move. Instead, I pressed the spacebar on the laptop. The first slide appeared. Rick's forged signature on a loan document for $25,000 under my mother's name. The yard fell silent. Someone gasped. Rick blinked, confused at first, then furious. "Avery, stop it," he snapped. "That is none of their business." I pressed the spacebar again. Casino debt statements, withdrawal slips from my mother's account, screenshots of dates and transactions. A murmur spread through the crowd. His sister whispered, "Rick, what is this?" He turned on her, snapping, "It is nothing, mind your own business." Spacebar again. The slide changed to the image of 16-year-old me tied to the railing in the snow. The rope, the shivering, the bruises, the timestamp in the corner. The yard erupted in gasps and horrified whispers. Colton froze near the grill, face draining of color. Rick spun toward the audience, shouting, "That is taken out of context. She was being dramatic." "She made me do that. It was discipline." People pulled back from him like he had become something poisonous. I took one step forward, voice steady, clear, controlled. "For years, you told everyone I was weak, that I was exaggerating, that I made things up, but the camera you installed recorded everything. And today, everyone will see who you really are." Rick lunged at me, wild, red-faced, furious. His hands reached for my shoulders, but he moved clumsily off balance. I stepped sideways, pivoted smoothly, and redirected his momentum exactly the way I was trained to do. I caught his wrist, turned it behind his back, and guided him to the ground using minimal force. Controlled, precise, non-violent. He hit the grass with a startled grunt. The crowd erupted in shouts. Someone screamed. Someone else yelled, "Call the police!" Rick thrashed beneath my grip, cursing me, threatening me, calling me every name he had ever used. But I held him exactly where he could not move without being hurt, and where he could not hurt anyone else. When he finally stopped struggling, I leaned down close enough for him to hear the steel in my voice. "You chained a soldier, and now everyone knows." Colton stumbled backward, dropping his drink. Then he turned and ran through the gate, disappearing down the street as people stared after him. The yard was chaos behind me, guests whispering fiercely, neighbors stepping back, relatives arguing. But I stayed calm, kneeling beside Rick with a professional control that was never violence. Only truth, public exposure. The moment everything cracked open. The moment I reclaimed everything he stole. And the moment everyone finally saw who the real Rick Hanlon was. The show was no longer his. It was mine. And justice had just begun. For a few seconds after I pinned Rick to the ground, the entire yard existed in a strange, suspended silence. Not quiet, just frozen. Guests stared at me with wide eyes, some with shock, some with disbelief, some with something that looked almost like relief. The projector light glowed against the sheet behind us, still showing the screenshot of 16-year-old me tied to the porch railing. The proof hung there like a verdict illuminated for everyone to witness. Rick kept cursing under his breath, his voice hoarse with rage, but his limbs were trapped under my controlled hold. My knee pressed just enough pressure near his shoulder blades to keep him down without harm. His right wrist remained pinned in a joint neutral position, exactly the way we practiced dozens of times during combatives. A few men stepped forward, uncertain whether to intervene, but I lifted my head and said clearly, "Stand back, please." They froze at my tone, the sharp authority of a soldier on duty echoing through its edges. One woman near the tables covered her mouth with both hands. Another whispered, "I knew something was wrong in that house." Somewhere to my left, I heard a shaky voice say, "I am calling the police." "Good," I said without lifting my gaze from Rick. His breathing turned shallow and fast. "You think the police are going to believe you?" he spat. "You think wearing that uniform makes you some kind of hero? They will laugh you out of the station." His words had no weapon anymore, not after everything the projector had shown, not after the entire yard watched him try to attack his own stepdaughter. I kept my expression calm. My heart was steady slow even as adrenaline rushed through my muscles. The training from basic lived inside my bones now, and it made everything sharp, controlled, deliberate. Minutes passed, then the distant rise of sirens cut through the late afternoon air, growing louder with each passing second. Rick tensed under me like an animal caught in a trap. "You will pay for this!" "Avery," he hissed. I leaned lower so only he could hear me. "No, you will." The gate swung open with a metallic clang, and two police cruisers pulled up one behind the other. Blue and red lights reflected off the balloons and the metal trays of food, scattering color through the yard. Officers stepped out, hands already on their belts, scanning the crowd. The first one to approach was Captain Harris, a local officer who had been with the Fayetteville Police Department for over 20 years. Tall, steady eyes, weathered but sharp. When he saw me, his expression softened by a small degree. He noticed the uniform first, the ACU, the boots, the posture, then the man pinned under me. He approached with measured steps. "Soldier," he said evenly. "You okay?" "Yes, sir," I answered, still controlling Rick's wrist and keeping my voice level. I used minimal force to restrain him after he attempted to tackle me during his own birthday party. Multiple guests witnessed it. Captain Harris nodded. A second officer, a younger woman, came closer, holding zip cuffs and a notebook. Harris crouched down, getting a closer look at Rick. "Sir, I am going to need you to stop moving," he said. Rick snarled. "Get her off me! She is making up lies. She is ruining my life." Captain Harris kept his voice steady. "We will hear every side, but first we are going to secure the situation." He looked at me. "I can take him from here." I nodded, once released Rick's wrist, and moved back with deliberate, controlled steps. My knees were stiff from holding him down, but I stayed straight. Two officers rolled Rick onto his stomach, checked his arms for injuries, then cuffed him. He writhed and shouted as they pulled him to his feet. "This is a mistake. I am the victim here. That girl is out of control. She is dangerous." The crowd murmured in disbelief. A few guests shook their heads. One older woman muttered under her breath, "I saw the whole thing, Rick. You cannot lie your way out of this." The officers guided him to the cruiser. I kept my hands clasped behind my back in the parade rest position, a stance that felt both grounding and protective. Captain Harris turned to me. "Tell me what happened." First, I asked if we could step inside, away from the crowd. He agreed, and we walked into the living room. My mother followed silently, her hands shaking, but her chin higher than I had seen it in years. I explained everything calmly and factually. The assault tonight, the false imprisonment the night he chained me outside. I showed him the red marks on my arm from the chain, the mud dried into the sleeves of my uniform. Then I showed him the evidence. All of it. The loan documents with forged signatures, the bank withdrawals, the gambling debts, the insurance policy, and finally the USB. I plugged it into the laptop and played a short portion of the footage from the night I was 16. The moment the recording showed me tied to the railing in the snow, the officers stiffened. My mother covered her face. Captain Harris was silent for a long moment, his jaw tightening slightly as he stared at the screen. When the clip ended, he exhaled. "Soldier, you did everything right tonight. Everything." His tone carried weight, firm, respectful, validating. He continued, "I am filing multiple charges: assault, false imprisonment, domestic abuse, possibly fraud once the bank documents are verified." My throat tightened, but I held steady. "And Colton?" I asked. He watched. He encouraged. He laughed. Harris nodded. "He will be brought in for questioning. If the witness statements support it, he could face charges as an accessory." I swallowed. "Thank you, sir." He looked at my uniform again, then into my eyes with something like respect. "You showed discipline tonight. Restraint. Not everyone can do that in a moment like this. You should be proud." My mother let out a sound halfway between a sob and a breath of relief. After taking statements from half the guests, the officers returned to the house. They informed Rick of his charges as he screamed protests from the back of the cruiser. But no one listened, no one defended him. Not even the relatives who used to swear he was a good man. The truth had spoken too loudly. As the cruisers pulled out of the driveway, kids stared from their yards. Neighbors stood on porches. The whole street knew. The whole world inside this neighborhood saw the fall of Rick Hanlon. I stood on the porch alongside my mother, watching the police cars disappear down the road. Her hand slipped into mine. "Avery," she whispered, "he is really gone." For the first time in years, her voice didn't tremble from fear. It trembled from release. I squeezed her hand and stood taller. "Yes, Mom, and he is not coming back." The weeks that followed felt strangely quiet, like the air after a storm when everything is still broken, but the wind has finally stopped screaming. Rick's arrest wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of the long legal aftermath that always follows a public collapse. Police reports, interviews, statements, evidence collection. Every day seemed to bring a new phone call or a new form to sign. But compared to the years of fear that filled this house, it all felt manageable. Structured, straightforward, like following a military procedure. I understood procedures. I trusted them. But my mother struggled with the process at first. She jumped every time the phone rang, expecting it to be Rick, even though the no-contact order had gone into effect within 24 hours of his arrest. When the district attorney's office contacted her for the first interview, she nearly fainted. But she didn't back out. Not this time. She walked into that office wearing the nicest blouse she owned and sat down with a bravery she didn't know she had. I sat beside her, silent but steady, the presence she used to be for me when I was small. The prosecutor assigned to our case, Assistant District Attorney Melissa Ward, listened carefully as I spoke through the timeline of events. I showed her the documents, the forged signatures, the bank withdrawals, the domestic history, the evidence of false imprisonment, and the footage from the security camera. She watched it all with tight lips and eyes that hardened every second. When the video ended, she leaned back in her chair and exhaled. "This is one of the worst long-term patterns of coercive control I have seen in years," she said. "We will prosecute fully, and we will win." My mother broke down crying right then, but not from fear, from release. The next weeks were filled with more interviews, witness statements from guests who saw the assault at the party, signed accounts from neighbors who overheard shouting in the past, depositions, medical evaluations documenting the marks on my arm from the chain and the minor sprain in my shoulder where Rick had grabbed me. When the court date was finally set for the pretrial hearing, the judge granted a full restraining order for 5 years. That alone made my mother cry for nearly an hour. But the real fight was over the house and the financial damage. Rick had always strutted around saying the house was his, that he paid for it, that my mother would be nothing without him. But the truth? The documents, the banking histories told a very different story. Each payment traced back to my mother's account. Every major purchase made with her salary. Every loan taken out in her name. Her, not him. He contributed nothing but debt. The hearing for the property division was held on a rainy Monday morning, the kind of cold, gray day that made everything feel heavier. I wore my uniform, not to intimidate, but because it was the truest version of myself I had. The soldier I had become was stronger than the frightened girl who grew up in that house. My mother wore a navy dress, simple but clean, her hair pinned back. She clutched the folder of documents to her chest like it was a life jacket. When we entered the courtroom, Rick was already there, sitting beside his lawyer. He looked different, smaller somehow, his hair uncombed, face unshaven. The arrogance he wore like a second skin had cracked and peeled, but when he saw me in uniform, he sneered. He muttered something to his lawyer without taking his eyes off me. I didn't react. I walked my mother to her seat, then stood beside her until the judge entered. Judge Holloway was known in Cumberland County for being firm and concise, the kind of judge who did not tolerate games. As soon as she took her seat, she reviewed the documents silently, then began the hearing. Rick's lawyer tried his best. He attempted to argue that Rick contributed to the mortgage through household labor and managing the property. The judge didn't even lift her eyebrows at that. "Show me financial contributions," she said sharply. "Actual payments, proof of income, transfers to the mortgage account, anything with his name on it." Rick's lawyer could not produce a single piece of evidence. When my mother's attorney, a calm, precise woman named Sarah Lynn, presented the bank statements, the judge nodded slowly as she examined them. "Every payment came from your account, Ms. Dalton. Every deposit to the household fund. Every loan repayment. Every utility bill. All yours." My mother whispered, "Yes, Your Honor," her voice trembling but clear. Judge Holloway looked at Rick. "Sir, do you wish to dispute any of these records?" Rick shifted in his seat. "They are forged," he said loudly. "All of them." My mother gasped softly. Rick continued. "She set me up. She planned this. She turned my whole family against me." Judge Holloway held up one hand. "Enough. This court will not tolerate outbursts." She glanced at the documents again, then at me, then back to my mother. "Based on the evidence presented, I rule that full ownership of the property is returned to Linda Dalton. There will be no further claim of marital interest by Mr. Hanlon." My mother's breath left her body in a shuddered gasp. Her hand found mine under the table and squeezed so hard it almost hurt. But the ruling was not finished. Furthermore, the judge continued, "Mr. Hanlon, you will be responsible for repaying the $25,000 loan taken out under Ms. Dalton's name as well as any accumulated interest." Rick jumped to his feet. "That is not fair. She owes me. She owes me everything." The judge raised her voice for the first time. "Sit down, Mr. Hanlon." He froze. "The court also upholds the 5-year restraining order and expands it to cover any form of contact, including electronic communication. Violation will result in immediate arrest." My mother covered her mouth and shook silently. This was the moment she had dreamed about, but never believed could happen. The domination that shaped her life for nearly a decade was being dismantled piece by piece in a room full of people who finally saw the truth. Then the judge addressed me. "Specialist Dalton, I understand you submitted evidence of a prior incident involving false imprisonment during your adolescence." "Yes, Your Honor." "Is that footage authentic?" "Yes, Your Honor." "Do you confirm it was recorded by a security device owned by Mr. Hanlon?" "Yes, Your Honor." She nodded. "That footage confirms a long-term pattern of abuse. It will be included in the case record." Rick groaned loudly in frustration, but the judge continued without looking at him. "Specialist Dalton, I commend you for your restraint during the incident at the birthday gathering. Your professionalism reflects well on your service." I felt my spine straighten even more. "Thank you." "Your Honor." The gavel struck once. "Court is adjourned." Everything after that moment felt distant, like I was walking underwater. Lawyers approached, shaking my mother's hand, telling her she was free now. Reporters outside the courthouse snapped photos and asked questions, none of which we answered. Rick was escorted out a side door by deputies still shouting, still insisting the world was against him. My mother and I stepped out into the parking lot, and the cold October wind hit our faces. She stopped right there in the sunlight, shoulders trembling. "Avery," she whispered, "I have my home back." I nodded. She looked at me with a mixture of awe, exhaustion, and rebirth. "And you were a soldier in there. You stood so calm, so strong." I did not feel strong. I felt empty and full at the same time, like a long-held breath had finally escaped. This courtroom victory was not just a legal win. It was something deeper, proof that truth could stand on its own legs. Proof that silence no longer shielded him. Proof that the soldier I had become could protect the girl I once was. My mother wrapped her arms around me in the middle of the parking lot. Cars drove past. People stared. But neither of us moved. We stayed there, holding on to each other, letting the weight of everything finally lift. Justice had not erased the past, but it had rewritten our future. And as I stood there in uniform under the cool Carolina sun, I realized something. For the first time in my life, the house we were returning to belonged to us. Not him, not his violence, not his shadow, us. And that was a victory I would carry long after this day ended. The courthouse parking lot always smelled like warm asphalt and faint exhaust, the kind of place where people walked with hurried steps and eyes fixed on their futures or their failures. As my mother and I stepped out of the courthouse after the ruling that returned the house to her, I felt a strange sensation settle inside me. Something like quiet clarity. Something like closure beginning to form its first faint shape. My mother squeezed my hand before heading toward her car. She needed a moment alone to breathe, and I understood. I told her I would meet her at home after checking in with the district attorney's office. She nodded and walked away, wiping her eyes but keeping her chin lifted. I stood by the column near the entrance, adjusting the strap of my uniform bag when I heard hurried footsteps behind me. The kind that did not belong to someone simply leaving court. The kind that belonged to someone chasing. At first, I ignored it, but the hairs on the back of my neck rose. Then I heard my name. Avery. My entire body stilled. Not from fear, from recognition. I turned slowly. Rick stood at the bottom of the courthouse steps, his posture hunched, his eyes wild and red-rimmed. His clothes looked wrinkled and dirty as if he had slept in them, his hair messy, his face streaked with dried sweat. But the most shocking part was the expression carved across his features. Desperation. He looked like a man drowning and reaching for anything to grab onto. "Avery, please," he said, lifting both hands slightly as if approaching a cornered animal. I froze where I stood. My training snapped in instantly. Assess environment, distance, potential threats. His hands were empty, his movements erratic but not aggressive. The bailiffs nearby looked at him, but since he remained outside the restricted zone, they did not intervene. I kept my voice level. "You are violating a restraining order." His breath stuttered out of him in a ragged gasp. No, I am not coming near you. I am staying right here. Please just hear me." I did not step closer. I did not step back. I simply watched him. He swallowed hard. His eyes flicked toward the parking lot where my mother had driven away. Then, back to me. His voice broke into something odd, something pleading. "Avery, I am sorry." Those words felt surreal coming from him, almost laughable if the situation were not so sharp and raw. "Sorry," he repeated as if forcing himself to believe the word would fix something. "I messed up, I know that. I was under a lot of stress. Work stress, money stress, life stress. Stress." He kept saying it like it was some divine justification, like abused women and children all across America had not heard that line from their abusers 1,000 times before. I stayed still silent, cold. He took a shaky breath. "I never meant to hurt you or your mother. Sometimes men just snap. Sometimes we lose control. I am going to counseling. Anger management. I am working on myself." "Please, Avery, do not let them destroy everything I built." "You built," I said quietly. He froze. I continued, my voice unwavering. "The house you claimed, the money you stole, the fear you fed on, the power you thought was yours. You did not build anything. You consumed it." Rick's mouth opened, but no sound came out. His chest heaved like he could not catch his breath. He wiped his face with both hands, and when he looked at me again, tears had gathered along the lower lashes. "Avery, I am begging you. Please speak to the judge. Tell her I am not a danger. Tell her I am a good man." I took a slow breath. My training kept my body still, but inside something was burning a cold, precise flame. He kept talking, his voice becoming shrill with panic. "You are my daughter. You owe me that. You owe me your loyalty after everything I gave this family." A hollow laugh escaped him. "Do you think the army will protect you forever? Do you think they will care about you? You need me. You both do." As he spoke, I felt something inside me settle completely. The last piece of doubt, the last fragment of the frightened girl he once controlled, dissolved. Rick's words were not powerful anymore. They were pathetic. They were the desperate flailing of a man losing the last shred of influence he ever had. No one around us approached. People exiting the courthouse simply slowed their steps, glancing between us and instinctively understanding that this was a confrontation years in the making. Rick's tears were falling freely now, streaking down his face. Avery, I swear I can change. I will get help. We can fix this. Just please do not walk away. I held his gaze without blinking. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, steady, and sharper than anything he had ever heard from me. You chained me like an animal. He flinched as if I had struck him. My voice stayed level. You chained a soldier, and you laughed. The truth hung in the air, a sentence, a verdict, a mirror he could not look away from. His face crumpled into something between shame and rage. His hands shook violently. Avery, please, I cannot lose everything. I cannot start over. I stepped back one firm, controlled step. You already lost it, not because of me, because of what you did. His breathing turned frantic. Avery, do not do this. I said nothing. I turned, walked away. Every step echoed across the pavement, firm, deliberate, unbroken. Behind me I heard him sob, loud, ugly, uncontrolled. He called my name over and over, the sound cracking through the parking lot like some wounded creature wailing after its prey escaped. I did not turn back. Soldiers moved forward. When I reached my car, I paused long enough to look at the courthouse in the rearview mirror. Rick was still on his knees near the steps, hugging himself, crying into his hands as deputies finally approached to escort him off the property for violating distance. I watched the scene with a strange quiet inside me. It was not triumph, it was not vengeance. It was clarity, the audacity return. The moment every abuser in every story comes back thinking the victim still belongs to them. But I was not his victim anymore. I started the engine and drove away while he disappeared behind me. For the first time in my life, I did not carry his shadow with me, and for the first time in his life, he realized he no longer had a shadow to hide behind. After Rick's breakdown in the courthouse parking lot, I thought the storm had finally passed. But storms never end neatly in families like ours. They ripple, they spread, they sweep through every corner and cling to every person who once benefited from the silence. And in our home, the first person swallowed by that ripple was Colton. For most of my life, Colton walked around with the easy arrogance of someone who never earned a single thing but believed the world owed him everything. He had Rick's approval the way I never did. He had Rick's name, Rick's privilege, Rick's protection. And maybe because of that, he grew up believing he was untouchable. Even after the police took Rick away, even after neighbors whispered about what they saw, even after the footage from the party spread among family group chats, Colton still acted as if nothing had changed. For the first week, he stayed with an aunt from Rick's side of the family. She had always adored him, calling him her handsome boy, and bragging about him even though he was 25 and unemployed. But after 2 days, she stopped answering his calls. After 3 days, her husband told him not to come back. Not because they believed in justice, not because they cared about what he did to me, but because they were embarrassed. They did not want to be associated with the family that had become the center of the most humiliating birthday party in Fayetteville. The whispers had grown into stories then, into gossip spreading through the church, through workplaces, through Facebook comments. People replayed the footage in their minds. The chain, the cage, the jokes, the laughter. Colton was not just a bystander, he was part of it, and now that the truth was out, no one wanted to claim him. The next time I saw him was at a gas station near Bragg Boulevard about 10 days after the court ruling. I had stopped there on my way back from a morning run training for my next PT test. He staggered out of the convenience store with a 6-pack of cheap beer in one hand and a bag of chips in the other. His hair was greasy, his clothes wrinkled, his face puffy and tired. When he saw me, he froze like a deer caught in headlights. Then he tried to turn away, but his foot slipped on the curb and he nearly fell. I caught his arm without thinking. Years of instinct. He jerked away from me as if my touch burned him. "Do not pretend you care," he snapped. His voice was rough from drinking and sleepless nights. I looked at him calmly. I was not pretending. He scoffed and ran a hand over his face. "You ruined everything. Dad is in court. I have nowhere to stay. Everyone hates us." I stood still, letting him empty himself out. "You chose your actions," I said quietly. You laughed while he chained me. You helped him drag me outside. You mocked me. You stood next to him when he hurt Mom. You were not a child then, Colton. You were a grown man." He glared at me, but the glare did not hold the sharpness it used to. It cracked around the edges like he was barely holding himself together. "Whatever. You think you are so perfect now that you are in the Army. You think a uniform makes you better than us." I did not answer. He looked around the parking lot and lowered his voice. "I lost my girlfriend because of you. Her family said they do not want someone like me around their daughter. If you had not exposed Dad, they would not know anything." Something inside me tightened, but not with guilt, with recognition. This was who he was, someone who blamed everyone but himself, someone who wanted the world to clean up his mess, someone who believed consequence was cruelty instead of justice. I walked away without another word. His voice rose behind me. "Do you hear me? You ruined my life." But the accusation had no power anymore. His life had been collapsing long before I came home. Mine had only forced the truth to the surface. Over the next month, the stories trickled back to me through neighbors and through relatives who quietly apologized to my mother at the grocery store or at church. They said things like, "We did not know. We should have said something. We thought Rick just had a temper." But the comments about Colton were always the same. He had become the family embarrassment. He had lost his place in the small community that once praised him simply for being Rick's son. He bounced between couches, sleeping in basements, staying with friends until their patience ran out. The job he once bragged about getting fell through because his employer saw the footage from the party and decided they did not want that kind of attention. His girlfriend blocked him. Then her brother confronted him in a parking lot and told him to stay away from their family. Every time people saw him, he had another beer in his hand, or he was asking someone for a loan, or arguing loudly with no one at all. One evening around dusk, my mother found a voicemail he had left on her phone. His voice was slurred. He called her a traitor, then begged her to let him stay at the house, then threatened to show up anyway, but she blocked his number. For the first time in her life, she protected herself instead of the people who hurt her. The breaking point came 3 weeks later. I was polishing my boots in my room when a notification flashed across my phone from the Cumberland County Sheriff's Office. Local news had posted the arrest report. Colton Hanlon, age 25, charged with DUI and reckless endangerment. He had been pulled over after swerving across 3 lanes, nearly sideswiping a family minivan. Officers found open containers scattered around his car. His mugshot told the story better than any article could. Eyes bloodshot, jaw slack, face fallen into something hollow. A faded bruise on his cheek, probably from a fight he started and lost. I stared at the screen for a long moment. Not shocked, not pleased, not angry. Just still. My mother walked into my room and saw the headline over my shoulder. She covered her mouth, then closed her eyes. "Oh, Colton," she whispered, not with affection, not with heartbreak, but with the kind of weary sadness that comes from watching someone choose the same road over and over, no matter how many signs warn them where it leads. I set my phone down. "Mom, do you want to talk about it?" She shook her head. "No, there is nothing left to say. He made his choices. The law made its decision. And we have our lives to rebuild." She squeezed my shoulder gently, then left the room. I sat alone in silence, letting the news settle inside me. My entire life, I thought justice was supposed to feel victorious, explosive, triumphant. But instead, it felt like this: quiet, steady. A slow exhale after holding my breath for too many years. I did not feel joy that Colton had been arrested. I did not feel regret. I did not feel grief for the downfall of someone who helped cause so much harm. What I felt was something colder and cleaner. Closure. A door finally closing. A chapter finally ending. A weight finally lifted. Not because he fell, but because I finally walked away. In the weeks after Colton's arrest, something shifted in the house. Not physically. The walls were the same color. The furniture sat in the same places. The windows still let in the same morning light. But the air was different. It carried quiet. Not the tense, suffocating kind that used to follow Rick from room to room. Not the brittle silence that froze my mother's voice in her throat. This was a new silence, one with space in it, breath in it, possibility in it. My mother spent the first few days after the court ruling wandering through the house like she was rediscovering a place she had not been allowed to enter for years. She paused in doorways, touched picture frames, opened cabinets. Sometimes she cried without warning. Sometimes she laughed softly at nothing at all. Sometimes she just stood in the kitchen with her hand on the counter, breathing deeply, as if the air finally belonged to her again. One morning, she asked if we could repaint the dining room. Another day, she asked if we could take down the heavy curtains Rick insisted on keeping closed. By the end of the week, sunlight poured into the house in places that had not seen sun in nearly a decade. But after the first wave of change settled, a new question formed in her eyes. I saw it every time she walked out onto the porch and looked not at the street, but at the horizon. She finally said it aloud one evening when we were eating dinner, just the two of us. "Avery," she said quietly, "I do not think I want to live here anymore." I set my fork down and waited for her to continue. "This house has history," she whispered. "Too much of it. The walls still remember. I want a place that does not." Her voice trembled not from fear this time, but from the first fragile step toward freedom. "Where do you want to go?" I asked. She hesitated, then said softly, "Wilmington." I blinked. The coastal city was 2 hours away. Peaceful, bright, quiet. The kind of place where retirees garden in their front yards and families walk along the riverfront at sunset. "Why Wilmington?" I asked. She smiled a little. "When you were a baby, we went there once for a day trip. You probably do not remember, but you laughed the entire time. It was the last place I felt happy before Rick. I want to feel that again." My heart tightened. Truthfully, I wanted that for her too. A new beginning. A place untouched by his shadow. "When do you want to go?" I asked gently. She looked at me with a steadiness I had not seen in years. "As soon as possible." The next week, we began searching for rentals, apartments, small houses, senior-friendly communities. She chose a modest 2-bedroom rental on a quiet street 10 minutes from the beach and 5 minutes from a supermarket that was hiring part-time workers. She had not worked in so long, her hands shook filling out the application. But she got the job. It was not glamorous. It was not high-paying. But it was hers, her own income, her own schedule, her own life. The day she received the email confirming her start date, she pressed her hands to her mouth and sobbed into them. Not out of sadness. Out of rebirth. On moving day, she packed her belongings carefully. Clothes, cookware, a few framed photos. She left almost everything Rick ever touched, including the living room furniture he bragged about buying, even though the receipts proved my mother paid for it. We rented a small U-Haul trailer and made the drive to Wilmington with the windows down. My mother insisted on playing music from the 80s, the songs she loved before life drained the joy out of her. She sang softly under her breath at first, then louder as the miles rolled by. By the time we crossed the Cape Fear River Bridge, she was singing full-voice wind, whipping her hair, sunlight catching her smile. I had not seen her smile like that since I was a child. The new house was small but cozy, a yard with patchy grass, a porch with peeling paint, a kitchen that smelled faintly of lemons. But it was safe. It was quiet. It was hers. She walked from room to room, touching the walls again, but differently this time. Testing them, claiming them, rewriting them. That first night, she cooked dinner in her own kitchen, humming while chopping vegetables. We ate at the little wooden table the landlord had left behind. She seemed nervous, then joyful, then overwhelmed in waves, her emotions shifting like tides. After dinner, she stepped out into the yard barefoot and dug her fingers into the soil. She knelt down and whispered something I could not hear. When I asked her what she said, she smiled. "I told the earth I am home now." Over the next weeks, I watched her bloom. She woke early for her shifts at the supermarket, walking to work under the soft Wilmington morning light. She learned the names of her co-workers. She started chatting with customers. She bought a small tray of herbs and lined them up on the kitchen windowsill. Basil, mint, rosemary. At lunch, she sat outside on her break to feel the sun on her face. She talked more, laughed more, moved more confidently. And every weekend I visited when I could, sometimes taking the train from Fayetteville, sometimes driving down after duty. She never let me leave without packing me a meal for the road. One Saturday, I found her sitting at the porch with seed packets spread across her lap. She looked up at me with bright eyes. "I want to start a garden," she said. "Flowers, vegetables, something alive that grows because of me, not in spite of me." I promised I would help her buy soil tools and pots. But first, I wanted to give her something else. Something she had not asked for. Something she deserved. The next weekend, I drove to a used car lot outside Wilmington. I found a reliable silver sedan with clean mileage and a good inspection history. Not fancy, not new, but dependable. Safe. Hers. When I pulled into her driveway, she stepped out onto the porch, wiping her hands on her apron from cooking dinner. When she saw the car, she froze. I tossed her the keys gently. She caught them clumsily. Her hands shook. "Avery," she whispered, "what is this?" "Your car," I said. "For work, for life, for everything ahead of you." She covered her face with both hands and sobbed in a way I had never seen before. Not like grief, not like fear, but like freedom releasing itself from the deepest part of her chest. She walked toward me and wrapped me in the tightest hug of my life. Her tears soaked into my shoulder. "Avery," she whispered, "thank you for saving me, for helping me live again." I held her and felt a quiet swell rise in my chest. "Mom, you saved yourself. I just stood beside you while you did it." That night, we sat on the porch watching the sky turn orange-pink, then purple. She rested her head on my shoulder like she used to when I was small. For the first time in my life, I did not feel like her protector or her burden. I felt like her partner in healing. Later, she whispered, "I never knew life could feel like this. Like soft air. Like room to breathe." I squeezed her hand. "This is what freedom feels like." She nodded, eyes glistening in the porch light. And for the first time in many years, I realized something. We were no longer running from something. We were walking toward something. A life rebuilt. A future rewritten. A quiet that did not hide fear, but held peace. Wilmington became her haven, and seeing her step into her new life became mine. The morning I drove back to Fort Liberty, the air felt colder than usual, sharp against my skin, as if the base itself was testing me, reminding me that I was returning not as the same girl who left, but as someone who had been broken, pushed, chained, and then rebuilt herself in ways I never could have predicted. The familiar sight of the training fields, the long stretches of road, the barracks lined in perfect symmetry, all of it hit me with a strange mix of comfort and gravity. This place had changed me first through sweat and discipline, and now through the clarity that came after surviving everything waiting for me back home. I parked near the administrative building, taking a moment to breathe in the way soldiers do, slow, steady, controlled. As I stepped out, I saw a figure with a stance I would recognize anywhere. Arms crossed, hat angled perfectly, posture sharp as a drawn blade. Drill Sergeant Price. He looked at me for a long moment, silently assessing, as if checking whether the soldier standing in front of him was the same recruit he trained or someone entirely new. I stood at parade rest waiting, letting him take his time. Finally, he spoke. "So I heard about what happened on your leave." His voice carried no judgment, no shock, no softness either. Just acknowledgement. I swallowed. "Yes, Drill Sergeant." He narrowed his eyes. "You stood tall, soldier. That is what we train for." Something in my chest tightened almost painfully, not from hurt, but from the weight of being seen. Truly seen. Not as the weak girl Rick named useless. Not as the quiet daughter afraid to breathe too loudly. Not as the servant of a household ruled by cruelty, but as a soldier. A woman who had endured and acted with discipline and clarity. Hearing that from a man like Drill Sergeant Price carried a gravity deeper than any applause or compliment. "Thank you, Drill Sergeant," I said quietly. He nodded once. "You ready to keep pushing your career?" That question caught me off guard. My career, my future. For so long, survival was the only thing on my mind. But now there was space to think bigger, to imagine something more than just making it through the next day. "Yes, Drill Sergeant," I said. "I am ready." "Good, because your chain of command wants to talk to you." He turned and began walking toward the company office, expecting me to follow. Inside, several NCOs and the first sergeant stood reviewing files. When I stepped in, they paused, looked at me, then exchanged glances. The first sergeant motioned for me to approach. "Private Dalton, we have received reports from local law enforcement about your actions during a domestic incident," he said carefully. I braced myself, uncertain how much they knew, how much they misunderstood, but then he continued, "And we want to commend the restraint you showed. You upheld Army values. You protected a civilian. You cooperated fully. You maintained discipline under emotional stress. These things are not easy." Something warm unraveled inside me, unexpected and almost overwhelming. "Yes, First Sergeant." He nodded at the paperwork on the desk. "Based on your performance in Basic and the recommendation from Drill Sergeant Price, we are nominating you for the NCO development track when your time in service allows." My breath hitched. Me. The girl who once ate alone in the garage because Rick said I did not deserve a seat at the table. The girl who walked into Basic feeling like scrap metal and walked out forged. The girl who had been chained to a dog cage by the man who thought she would never rise high enough to challenge him. That girl was being considered for the path to becoming a leader. A non-commissioned officer, a sergeant. The weight of it did not crush me. It steadied me. "Thank you, First Sergeant," I said, and my voice cracked just a little. Not from weakness, but from the magnitude of finally stepping into a life that belonged to me. After the meeting, I walked outside, letting the sun hit my face. Soldiers marched across the courtyard, cadence-smooth boots hitting concrete in perfect rhythm. I watched them for a moment, feeling something I had never felt so clearly. Belonging, purpose, future. Later that day, during PT formation, Drill Sergeant Price approached me again. "You know," he said, "leadership is not about yelling the loudest or running the fastest. It is about standing when standing is hard. You have already learned that." His words settled deep, deeper than he probably intended, because I knew standing had been hard. Standing against Rick, standing against years of humiliation, standing in front of dozens of people at that birthday party and exposing the truth while keeping enough control to not lay a single unlawful hand on him, standing in that courtroom watching justice finally tilt in our favor, and standing in front of my mother as she built a new life piece by piece. Standing had become part of me. That evening after chow, I sat on my bunk staring at my hands. They were steady, stronger than they had ever been, not just physically, emotionally. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who snuck out of the house with a backpack full of clothes because Rick told her she would never survive on her own. I thought about the recruit who struggled through her first ruck march wanting to quit but refusing to fall back. And I thought about the soldier I was now, the one who faced down a monster without throwing a punch, the one who protected her mother, the one who chose justice over rage, the one who earned her place. That night I called my mom. She answered on the second ring, breathless, sounding happier than I remembered. "How was your day, sweetie?" I smiled. "Good, Mom. Actually, better than good." She waited quietly, sensing something was coming. "They nominated me for the NCO track." I heard her gasp. "Avery, that is wonderful." My throat tightened. All those years, she watched me be torn down. Now she got to watch me rise. "I am proud of you," she said, her voice trembling. "I am proud of you every day, but this is something special." I closed my eyes, letting her words sink in. "Thank you, Mom." When I hung up, I sat in the dim barracks light for a long time, not thinking, just feeling. Pride, stability, gratitude, growth, the quiet after a storm. I knew challenges would come. I knew service was never easy. I knew stepping into leadership would test me in ways I had not experienced yet, but I also knew this. I had already survived worse than any obstacle the Army could throw at me. I had survived home, and now I was writing my own future. Step by steady step, rank by earned rank, breath by resilient breath. Tomorrow, PT would start at 0500, the day after that training. After that, leadership courses, volunteer hours, field exercises, evaluations. And one day, maybe soon, I would stand in front of a group of recruits not unlike the girl I used to be, and I would say the words that shaped me. Stand tall, soldier. Even when it hurts, even when they doubt you, even when the world tells you that you are less. Stand tall until you rise. And I knew when that day came, I would mean every word. I drove back to my old neighborhood on a cool Sunday morning, the kind of morning that feels quiet even before you open your car door. The sun was barely up and the streets were empty, the world still stretching awake. The closer I got to the house, the slower I drove, letting the familiarity settle over me like a thin layer of dust. I had not been back since the court ruling, since Mom moved to Wilmington, since Rick was removed from everything he once controlled. This trip was not for confrontation, not for closure through drama, not for grand statements. It was for me. I still had a few boxes stored in the closet of the room I grew up in. Old notebooks, some clothes, a few photos that had survived the chaos of my childhood, and maybe some remnants of who I used to be. As I pulled into the driveway, I sat behind the wheel for a long moment, staring at the house. It looked smaller than I remembered, maybe because I had grown, or maybe because fear had once made it seem bigger, darker, heavier. The yard was quiet, the grass slightly overgrown, the porch light still broken, the same crack in the window near the living room that had been there since I was 14. Everything looked frozen in time except for me. I stepped out of the car, taking a slow breath as my boots touched the pavement. Not army boots today, just simple sneakers. Civilian Avery blending with soldier Avery in a way that felt strangely right. I walked toward the front door, and it creaked open when I touched it. The house was empty, but the smell was the same, a mix of dust, old wood, and faint traces of stale beer that seemed soaked into the floorboards. No yelling, no footsteps, no heavy breathing from a man pacing with anger in his throat. Just silence. A silence so full I could hear my heart beat. I stood in the entryway, letting memories press against me but not crush me. The living room looked untouched, the sagging couch, the chipped coffee table, the dent on the wall from a night I tried to stand up for myself, and Rick pushed me harder than he meant to, or maybe exactly as hard as he meant to. I walked past it with no reaction. My old room was down the hall to the left. The door still had the faded sticker I had put there when I was 12, a cheap star decal that lost its shine a decade ago. When I pushed the door open, it groaned in protest. The room was smaller than I remembered, too. The mattress gone, the posters gone, but the closet door slightly open as if waiting for me. I packed quietly, moving quickly. A few shirts, some journals, my high school yearbook, and a shoebox of old letters from a friend who moved away before senior year. It was simple, efficient, military. I could feel the shift in myself even in the way I folded shirts. My movements were sharper, more deliberate. There was no girl in this room anymore, just a woman who survived it. When I finished packing, I zipped the duffel and stood up, stretching my back, glancing around the room one last time. No sadness, no longing, not even relief. Just acceptance. But I knew I was avoiding one thing. The backyard. The cage. The place where my hook began, the place that changed everything. I could have left without seeing it, but something inside me refused to walk away without facing that space one last time. Closure does not whisper. It waits. So I walked through the kitchen, stepping over a stain on the linoleum floor, and pushed open the back door. The hinges squeaked sharp and familiar. The early morning air hit my face cool and steady. The yard was wet with dew, the grass slick under my shoes, the sky pale blue. And there it was, the dog cage, sitting near the old shed rust, creeping along its edges, door hanging open as if inviting or warning depending on who looked at it. My feet stopped on their own. The memory of rain hitting my skin, the sound of Rick's laugh, the cold metal around my wrists and neck, the humiliation, the fear, the rage, the breaking point, all of it flashed through me, but only as echoes, not as wounds. I walked closer until I stood a single step away from it. The cage was smaller than I remembered, just like the house. Cruelty always feels bigger when you are trapped inside it. The lock was gone, probably taken by the police, or maybe my mom. The door hung slightly crooked. I stared at it for a while, my breath, slow, steady shoulders relaxed. I waited for anger to rise, for pain, for bitterness. Nothing came. The silence inside me was deeper than the silence around me. I crouched down and pressed my fingers against the metal bars. Cold, rough, real, but no longer powerful. This thing used to be a symbol of who I was in that house. Now it was just scrap. Something shifted inside me, not a tear, not a tremble, just a soft internal click, like the last puzzle piece falling into place. I reached up and slowly, gently pushed the cage door closed. It clicked shut quietly, not forced, not slammed, just closed. I stood up, letting the moment settle. That door was not closing on my life, not closing on my past, not closing on who I used to be. It was closing on the hold this place once had on me. The house behind me felt hollow of meaning now, the yard empty of threats, the cage stripped of its power. I looked around one last time, letting the cool air wash over me. The sun was rising now, painting the yard in soft gold. A new day, a new chapter. A life I was building, not escaping. I walked back into the house, grabbed my duffel, turned off the light, even though the bulb barely worked, and stepped outside, locking the door behind me because it felt right, not because I owed the house anything. When I got to my car, I opened the trunk, placed my bag inside, and paused with my hand on the door handle. I took one last look at the house, not to say goodbye. There was nothing to say goodbye to, but to acknowledge that it existed and that I survived it. That was enough. I got into the car, started the engine, and pulled away slow at first, then faster, letting the road stretch ahead of me wide and open. I did not look in the rearview mirror. I did not need to. Some things are meant to be left behind without one final glance. When I reached the highway, I rolled down the window, letting the wind hit my face sharp and cool, carrying the scent of pine and early morning sun. I felt something settle into place inside me, something steady and calm. No rage, no heartbreak, no fear, just peace. Quiet, uncomplicated peace. The kind you earn after standing tall through storms that were never yours to carry. The kind you feel when you finally walk away from a cage knowing it can never hold you again. And as the road opened wider and Fort Liberty came closer, I whispered to myself, not as a soldier, not as a survivor, but as a woman finally free. I am done. I have sat with many moments in my life that felt impossible to explain, but none settled into me the way this final stretch of quiet did after I drove away from that house for the last time. There is something strange about closure. People expect it to feel like fireworks or triumph or some kind of cinematic release. For me, it felt like the soft click of that cage door in the backyard and the steady hum of my car engine as the road opened up ahead. I kept driving until the neighborhood disappeared behind rows of trees and long stretches of open highway. The world felt calmer than I remembered. Maybe because for the first time I was not running from something, I was simply moving forward. As the light changed from the faint gray of early morning to the warmer gold of the rising sun, I felt the weight of everything I had gone through begin to fall away piece by piece, not in dramatic breaks, but in quiet, subtle releases. The humiliation, the anger, the fear, the doubt, all the echoes of my childhood were dissolving into the rear horizon. I thought about how many people in this world carry wounds not on their skin, but in the silent spaces of their lives. Wounds from families that were supposed to protect them. Wounds from people who should have offered love, but offered control. Wounds from houses that should have been homes, but became battlegrounds. I realized that if I had not joined the army, if I had not learned discipline, steadiness, resilience, and belief in my own worth, I might have lived my whole life thinking I deserved the way they treated me. Basic training did not just teach me how to stand, it taught me how to stand up for myself. It taught me that my voice had value even when others tried to crush it. It taught me that strength is not loud, it is quiet and consistent and calm in the face of chaos. As I drove, I thought about Mom settling into her new life in Wilmington, starting her garden, smiling more often, calling me without whispering or checking over her shoulder. I thought about how survivors sometimes take longer to heal. Not because they are weak, but because they were forced to stay silent for too long. I thought about Rick and the choices that brought him to the place he now stood, not in our house, not in my life, but in a world where accountability finally reached him. I thought about Colton, who grew up believing the world owed him something and learned too late that entitlement offers no real foundation when consequences arrive. I did not wish them pain, but I did not carry their burdens anymore. Their stories no longer shaped mine. I crossed the state line back toward Fort Liberty, feeling a strange blend of sorrow, gratitude, and quiet satisfaction. Sorrow for the years I lost and the moments that shaped me through pain instead of love. Gratitude for the people who taught me to rise, for Drill Sergeant Price, for my battle buddies, for my mom. And satisfaction because justice had not come through violence or revenge, but through truth, discipline, and the calm certainty of who I had become. As the miles passed under my tires, I began thinking about people who might hear my story, people who might recognize pieces of their own past in mine, people who might still be standing at their own breaking point, waiting for the courage to take one more step. I thought about how sometimes the most powerful stories are the quiet ones, the ones where someone finally says enough, then chooses to walk forward even if their legs shake. And now I find myself speaking directly to you, the person listening, the person watching, maybe in your living room or on your phone during a late shift, or while sitting alone in a quiet space you carved out for yourself. Maybe you have lived through something similar. Maybe you are living through it right now, or maybe you know someone who is. Maybe you never had a cage in your yard, but you had other versions of it. Emotional cages, financial cages, silent cages built from years of criticism or control. Maybe you had a Rick or a Colton or a house that carried more fear than comfort. And maybe a part of you is still waiting for the moment when you finally feel strong enough to close that door for good. If my story has shown me anything, it is that strength does not always roar. Sometimes it is simply the decision to take the next breath, the next step, the next truth. Sometimes it is the willingness to believe that your life can be different from the one you were born into. So I want to ask you something honest, something direct, something I asked myself countless times during the darkest hours of my life. Where are you watching from, and what would you have done if you were me, standing in that yard with the rain on your face and the cage behind you? Would you have fought back? Would you have screamed? Would you have stayed silent? Would you have walked away? Would you have returned for justice? Would you have closed that final door the way I did? I want to know, because every person who watches, every person who listens, carries a story of their own. And sometimes sharing it is the first step toward freeing yourself from the cage someone else put you in. My story is done, but yours might just be beginning. Where are you watching from, and what would you have done if you were Avery?